better. We're continuing our series in Numbers, and Numbers 11, really, but I wanted to start with a passage from 1 Corinthians 10. The apostle writes, "I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and they all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness." He's referring to the events that happened during the Exodus from Egypt to Canaan, 40 years. The book of Numbers tells the story of 38 of those years. But this book isn't just a dry recitation of history. It contains the lessons for us, and we'll be making some lessons as we go. Sometimes the lessons you can just apply yourself, but we'll be looking at this chapter. Later on in this chapter, chapter 10 of 1 Corinthians, Paul specifically refers to the events we'll be talking about. He says, "We must not grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer." Then he makes his point again. "Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the ends of the ages has come. Therefore, let anyone who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall." It was a lesson for them, but it's a lesson for us. We need to get the lesson from it. He says, "No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man." And the temptation we're looking at this morning is the temptation to complain. God has a complaint department, but there's the right way to go to the complaint department and a right way to register your sense of wrong, I guess. But Numbers 11 is about a problem, about the complaints that problem precipitated, and then two solutions to the problem, with lessons for both Moses and for the people of Israel. So that's where we're headed. To pick up in Numbers 10, Israel spent a year at Sinai, camped by the mountain, where Moses received the law. That's where they had that wild rebellion. The Levites ran through the camp, killed some of the worst offenders, and brought order back. But things started to happen in the second year. Numbers 10 says, "On the first day of the first month of the second year, the command came down to erect the tabernacle." They had a year to collect the materials to build it. The first day of the first month of the second year, put up the tabernacle. Then, on the first day of the second month of the second year, the command came down to organize for travel. We're moving out. And they had a square configuration, 3 tribes on each side, the Levites following, camped around the tabernacle. So organize, we're heading out. Then on the 20th day of the second month, the command came, "Let's go." And you can imagine moving hundreds of thousands of people through the wilderness. The first journey was short. It was only a 3-day journey out of Sinai to a place called Paran. We're not sure if it was during that short 3-day trip or if it was after they arrived or how long. That's not really made clear. But they reached their limit. The people said, "That's it." In Numbers 11 says, "And the people complained in the hearing of the Lord." We're not sure if he overheard or if they directly addressed God. The implication is that God overheard them complaining. They complained within the Lord's earshot, so to speak. They complained about their misfortunes. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled. And the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some outlying parts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. Now, what was that all about? First of all, we shouldn't rush to judgment that they were complaining about their misfortunes. Tent life is hard. And imagine living in tents for 14 months at this point. Not only that, they had the same thing to eat, morning, noon, and night. Manna, manna, more manna. If you had to eat at your favorite restaurant every meal for 14 months, and you got to order anything off the menu, you would be tired of it. They are tired. Imagine eating potatoes. And you can fry them, you can scramble them, you can boil them, but there's just so many ways to eat a potato. And they had had enough of that. And they started to complain. It was misfortunes, no house, no Nile River to bathe the kids in, just out there in this desert, and it's hot. Wow. Baby whining. You try to spoon a little bit more manna to the baby. The kid's crying, I can't eat this, Mom. It's terrible. Dad saying, maybe Moses likes this mess. I can't stand it. Who's going to do something about it? You can just see the murmuring, the mumbling, the grumbling in the camp. They just had it. They were hoping, I guess, when they moved from Sinai to Paran that things would get better. They didn't get better. They were the same. It was still in the wilderness. You can imagine the mothers. I can't put up with all this whining, one more complaint, and I'm shutting down the kitchen forever. Go feed yourself. I can't fix it. They're all complaining. Psalms 106:25 refers to this very same period, and it says they grumbled in their tents. Now, what that means is they were in there just stirring each other up, not to love and good works. They were stirring each other up to rebellion, feeding each other with dissatisfaction, negativity. I don't know about you, brother. I can't stand any more of this manna. I've just had it. You're not kidding, man. It's terrible. And so it gets worse and worse. They just grumbled in their tents, built up dissatisfaction. Well, so what? What's wrong if you blow off a little bit of steam? As it turns out, there's a lot wrong with that. All their negative talk, by focusing on what they didn't like, they had forgotten the future. They were focused just on the present, focused on their appetites. Their eyes were off of God. They finally complained to Moses, to put out the fire, and he did. No one turning to God, just egging each other on. They should have been grateful for their deliverance. Sometimes we forget, not only did they get their physical freedom, when they left, God said, ask the Egyptians for some of their wealth. And they did. And the Egyptians gave them gold and silver, expensive clothing. One account of what they gave them said jewelry. They gave them tons of stuff. Where do you think the golden calf came from? These were slaves, but they had just tons of material possessions to build a new nation. Had all of that, but all they could see was manna. You ever done that, focus on a problem? Pretty soon it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and all you see is the problem, and you lose sight of everything else. That was what's happened. They started, fantasizing about the past, as we will see. They forgot their blessings, forgot to count their blessings. Negativity will consume your life. It'll burn you up. It'll sour you. You wonder what's wrong with the soup, and you're the one that poured soured milk into it and coffee grounds. You sour the emotional quality of the community, and then you wonder what's wrong with the community. It's so negative there. That's what they had done. Colossians 3:15 says, let the peace of God rule in your hearts and be thankful. They were stoking up dissatisfaction, not peace. They were not thankful. Triumph and defeat both start in the mind, and they were headed towards the defeat of Israel. James, in James 3, I think it is, he reminds us that negative speech is set on fire by hell. That's where all this negative talk comes from, is from hell. You talk about a can-do spirit. What hell provides us is a can't-do spirit. If you live in the devil's kingdom, that's where seldom is heard an encouraging word, where the skies are cloudy all day. And they created that kind of a world, and that's where they were living. So their complaints did a lot. The Lord was angry. He sent a fire. It doesn't say it burned people, but it burned up some things on the outlying parts of the camp. And that was suitable because their negative talk was setting the camp on fire. So the physical fire was suitable for that, adequate metaphor for that. It was a warning. But they didn't take the warning. They thought the problem was the fire and not their negative talk. So they've had their warning. Oh, this was what James 3 says about the tongue as a fire. He just gave them a punishment that suited their talk. Verse 4 of Numbers 11. Now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving. And the people of Israel also wept again and said, "Oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt. They cost nothing. The cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there's nothing at all but this manna to look at." Some people say verse 4 doesn't follow the first two verses. I think it probably does, but at any rate, it starts up again. Verse 4 says it started up again among the rabble that was among them. Well, who is that rabble? That rabble was called in other places a mixed multitude. They weren't members of the Israelite community. They were Egyptians and other captive peoples. And they followed Israel out. They said, Israel's making their escape. We're going with you. They heard the Israelites talk about there's a land of milk and honey. And we're going there. It's our ancestral land. And they said, we're going too. We like milk and honey. We like to be a part of that. And so they go with them. They weren't camped at the center of the camp. They were probably camped at the outskirts, and that's where the fire first broke out. But the rabble had this strong craving. The same thing can happen in churches. These people were with the Israelites, but they weren't Israelites. They had not really bought in. Some of them, hopefully a lot of them, eventually identified with Israel and became a part of Israel, but not all of them. Some of them were just there to get what they could get. We might think of them as what's sometimes called a rice Christian, someone who comes to get something, not to give something. They're not about persevering to the end. They're about immediate benefit. And they come for the sake of a ministry, or they come for the sake of a person or something, but they're not all in with God. And that's sort of the status of these people. They were there, but they were there for what they could get, and when they stopped getting, didn't meet their needs, they were ready to start a little trouble, complaints. God knows our needs. God meets our real needs and not our perceived needs. What they needed was food. God provided manna. What they wanted was onion and melons and garlic and fish. He said, "You don't need that. I'm providing what you need." They're also fantasizing about the past. These people have been slaves. Were things really that great? If they'd been that great, why were they so eager to live? Sometimes that happens when things are tough in the present. We start to fantasize about the past and imagine it being better than it was. That's negative as well. Well, it got worse. The people of Israel wept again. and said, "Oh, that we had meat." They wept again. Problem comes back up again. And that word weeping refers to public expressions of unhappiness, lamentation, complaining. Strong's Concordance uses all of these words. It's more than just private unhappiness. They are out in public weeping. This is terrible. Today, they might have been on their apartment balconies with a pot, banging it with a spoon, or they might be sitting in the car beating the horns of the car. They were publicly expressing their dissatisfaction. Our strength is dried up. That sounds kind of like going on strike, doesn't it? Feed us this manna, we can't go on. We're not going to do anything till we get something better to eat. And they said, nothing at all but this manna to look at. I'm not going to eat it anymore. We're going on a hunger strike. Things are getting ugly at this point. Well, it's easy to think the squeaky wheel gets the grease. But you need to think when you're squeaking, is there grease? And who has the grease, and how can you best get it? Just kicking and screaming and making a scene and making everyone around you uncomfortable doesn't make things happen the way you want them to. Ask any mother. Demands for time, demands for attention, demands for money. You don't have it. Frustration builds, tempers flare, and it just kind of goes worse. Let's continue with the story, and then we'll... Verse 10 says that Moses heard the people weeping throughout their clans, everyone at the door of his tent. Started out grumbling in their tents. Now they're standing in front of the door, mom and dad and all 7 kids, screaming and weeping. We can't take it anymore. What a complaint. That negativity spreads. The anger of the Lord blazed hotly. God's fed up with it. Moses was displeased. And then look at this. Moses turns on God. Moses says to the Lord, "Why have you dealt ill with your servant? Where am I to get meat to give all these people? For they weep before me and say, 'Give us meat, that we may eat.'" He starts blaming God. Why'd you give me this job? They're all complaining. He's complaining to God. That negativity spreads. Moses is fed up. He's ready to opt out. He says, "I'm not able to carry all this people alone. The burden is too heavy for me. If you're going to treat me like this, kill me at once. If I find favor in your sight, that I may not see my wretchedness." You can complain enough that you just drive the one in charge over the top. That's it. I've had it. Your customers complain. Your employees complain. Everybody's going on strike. I can't take it. And finally you say, "I've had it." You lock the doors and you walk out. You're on your own, you know. I know teachers have been tempted. And a few occasions I've known teachers, not me, who got fed up with a class. And you can do this at certain academic levels. But I've had it. No one read, no one's prepared to discuss, no one has done anything. Goodbye. Come back when you do your work and walk out the door. That's where Moses was. I've had it. I'm not going to be a part of this situation any longer. We've got to be careful about the effects and the consequences of our complaints. They can and they will do a lot of damage. Damage to us, damage to leaders, damage to the whole situation. Hebrews 13:17 says this. This is from the New Living Translation. "Obey your spiritual leaders and do what they say. Their work is to watch over your souls, and they are accountable to God. Give them reason to do this with joy and not with sorrow. That will certainly not be for your benefit. Now, certainly leaders can be wrong. They can be wrong in life. They can be wrong in doctrine. They can make lots of mistakes. And there's a way to handle serious problems. Scripture talks about that. We won't look at those, about getting witnesses and all this kind of stuff. So that's not to say anytime in everything a leader says is always right. But as a general course, don't make it difficult for the preacher and bring every complaint to him. I want to know how much longer are we gonna, and just pour negativity and negativity and negativity upon individuals. Nobody benefits when leaders are put in a pressure cooker and you turn up the heat and you put them under pressure and you cook them a while. You're going to soften them up, and you may just cook them down to mush. But anyway, to say all of this, monotonous food, the problem, and then a negative spirit, a grasping, what have you done for me lately spirit, put those two together, and you end up with a crisis. And that's where Israel is at this point. It's a crisis. First of all, it's a crisis of order. When they're standing outside the tent, whole families, all the families, yelling and protesting about the food, we're at the version of a breakdown. Things are about to fall apart. One leader may say, I'm going back. We're going to see that in the future. I'm going to go back. Some people say, I know where some better food is, follow me. They were in danger of the whole thing just exploding and people going all kind of directions, choosing different leaders, promising them more. So the whole order was threatened. It was a crisis of faith. Do we trust God to give us what we need? Will God provide what we need when we need it? Faith in God's on trial. It was a crisis of leadership, a crisis for Moses. Can I keep doing this? I can't do it. Who's going to lead? We're out here in the wilderness. Life is a wilderness. Who's going to step up? I've just had it. I'm ready to step off the boat and just let it float away. Well, in the rest of the chapter, we learn some important lessons. Moses learns a lesson. Israel learns some important lessons. And we need to be smart, take Paul's advice, and learn from them. So here's some lessons. The first lesson, everyone has his limits. You can't do it alone. Moses had to learn that. That doesn't mean you shouldn't try. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do your best. But no one can carry all the weight all the time. Maybe you think you have all the answers. Maybe you don't trust anybody else. Some families work that way. Sometimes a husband, occasionally a wife will say, I'm going to make all the decisions. I don't need any feedback from my wife. Just keep your opinion to yourself. I know what's best. Don't want to hear from the kids. You don't know what you're talking about. I'm the man. Sometimes churches do that. We have a pastor. He's going to make every decision. He's going to decide everything. And he'll control the budget. He will control the education. He'll control the class. He'll control everything. Nothing happens without his express permission. And that may feel empowering. And sometimes churches want that. This feels good. We've got somebody at the top. We know who's there. We can go straight to the top if we need something. They'll carry all the burden, and the person at the top may think, at last, my genius has been recognized, and I'm in charge of it all. Never works out. Moses was in that position, and it just about killed him before he learned he's got to have help. It broke him. He went to God, just kill me. At that point, he's really, really ready for help. God's plan was for elders in Israel. Same plan for today, I think. This isn't the first or the last time we read about elders in the story of the Exodus. In Exodus 3, when Moses comes back from the desert to confront Pharaoh, before he does that, he goes to the elders of Israel, tries to get their support. before he goes, they were there. Leadership was in place. Elders were older men, wiser men, experienced men, capable, trustworthy men. So they were there. That leadership is present. But in Exodus 18, verses 13 through 26, Moses is getting overtasked again. Every complaint among hundreds of thousands of people is coming to him. Every disagreement over a goat that got loose and ate somebody's robe or whatever it was, all of those disputes coming to Moses, driving him to the brink at that point. Well, Moses' father-in-law tells Moses to select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and let these people serve as judges. You can't bribe them. They're good men. That word elders wasn't used, but that idea of you've got to have help and choose men that essentially sort of meet the qualifications of a biblical elder even. Well, in Exodus 24, the Lord tells Moses and Aaron's two oldest sons, and 70 elders to meet him on Mount Sinai. And they go halfway up and they stop. They have a feast. It's a bizarre scene, but they have a feast and God is there. They see God. Heaven opens up. The sky's like lapis lazuli. We don't know exactly what happened, but those 70 elders are invited up to have a feast. They're sharing that vision of God, and then Moses goes all the way to the top where he receives the 10 Commandments. In Numbers 11, God tells Moses to choose 70 elders to assemble in front of the tabernacle. Don't know what it's about the 70, but again, choose 70. I'm sure it was some of the same 70 that we've heard about before. Some of them could have died, gotten sick, had to be replaced. But choose 70, and this is what I will do. I will put a portion of your spirit, the spirit I've given you, spirit of insight, love, compassion, courage, strength, all those things needed for leadership. I'm going to take a portion of your spirit and put it upon these 70 men. He says, Moses, I know you've reached your limit. Help is on the way. It's going to come in the form of these men, these 70. The idea of 70 persisted. The Sanhedrin, that Jewish Supreme Court had 70 men. That idea that 70 was an important number. So that idea kept on. If you think about this, Jesus chose 70 disciples to send out as missionaries. First, he sent the 12 apostles. Then he chose 70 other men, and he sent them out on a commission. And they came back and rejoiced that the demons were under their power and control. Well, they're like the 70 elders that helped Moses. These 70 disciples helped the apostles to share and spread the gospel. It was more work than 12 men could do. The 70 here to help them. A lot of the commentators I read believe that Philip the evangelist was not the apostle Philip, but he was one of the 70. And we see him with the Ethiopian eunuch. Others think some of those 70 that God empowered in their missionary evangelistic efforts were those who went to Antioch and first taught the Gentiles. So God has a plan. Elders, 70, all of that. Something interesting happened with the 70 men. Show up in front of the tabernacle, and I will put my spirit upon them. It's kind of like they have Pentecost in a way. 2 of the men didn't show up. Scripture doesn't say why. Maybe illness. Maybe they were ceremonially unclean if they had touched a dead body, if a relative had died and they'd helped prepare the body the day before and now appear, I can't go, I'm unclean. We don't know why, but 2 men didn't show up. And the 68 who were there complained about it. They said, these guys weren't here, but we've heard they're out in the camp prophesying like we prophesied, showing the Spirit was on them. Moses said, don't worry about it. I wish everybody in Israel was prophesying right now. God chose them to prophesy. Don't stand here and don't say, they're not right here with us, so they can't be right. What are they doing prophesying? Moses says God gave them that power. He chose them, and they have it. That happened other times and places as well. There were I'm trying to remember the case. I think it's in Mark chapter 9. I'm not positive of the reference. But Jesus came and the apostles came to Jesus and said, we met some men who were casting out demons in your name. And they're not of our number. We don't know them. They're not in our group. But yet they're speaking in your name and casting out demons. What should we do about it? And Jesus said, don't do anything about it. You don't have to make a judgment about them. He said, no one who is doing that will not continue on with me. So sometimes that's a lesson for us. Sometimes we're so busy saying, this person is not in my group. Maybe they're not right. Doesn't belong to my congregation. I can't really talk to them or whatever it is. And just say, God has given that. Let it go. It'll all work out. Okay. God had an even more tragic lesson for Israel. And we can call this lesson, be careful what you wish for. Israel went from murmuring in their tents to this big, loud protest outside the tents, threatened to become ugly and violent. It was divisive, threatened the survival of Israel. Wow. But you know what? This wasn't the first time they demanded meat. Exodus 16 says that in the second month of the first year, they had demanded meat. They were running out of food, said, we need meat, we need bread. This is 1 year later. This is the second month of the second year. So 1 year earlier, the second month of the first year, they had demanded food. What happened on that occasion? Again, you can read about that in Exodus 16. God covered the camp with quail. The birds came straight to them, landed there among them. Just go out and fix yourself a big pot of quail stew. He sent meat, blessed them at that point. He also sent manna. They gathered manna. They had meat and bread to eat. Some people think that quail was a one-off event. Some people think it was an occasional event. Some people say if these were migratory birds, every year God would blow them to the camp. And so at least once a year they could have meat. But they jumped the gun. They couldn't wait. They were complaining. They didn't wait to give God time to send the quail. They snatched defeat from the jaws of victory in that sense. When the manna first arrived, God said, just eat enough for that day. Don't try to store it up. If you do, it'll rot. Some of them tried to store it up, and it rotted. Well, we see a replay of that with the quail. This year, they were so upset, God said, you want quail? I'm going to give you quail. I've forgotten. Verse 18, God tells Moses, tell the people, consecrate yourselves for tomorrow, and you shall eat meat. You're going to have meat tomorrow. You said, who will give us meat to eat? It was better for us in Egypt. Therefore, the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. And so they had meat. They had a lot of meat. God sent so much meat that they didn't know really what to do with it all. Be careful what you ask for. Sometimes we ask for things that seem like we've got to have it. I've got to have this person. I've got to have this house. I can't live without this job. I've got to live in this city. We have our demands. Be careful what you wish for. If you demand for it, it may not turn out the way you want. They demanded meat. God said, I'll send you meat. And let's go back. He'll give you meat and you'll eat it. This time, he doesn't send a small amount of food, a day's worth of food. He sends a huge amount of food, but it's about a day's journey away. They have to travel a full day there and a full day back to get it. So many birds that the smallest amount gathered was 10 homers, which for us would be, in terms of bushels, about 60 bushels. That's the least anybody gathered. That's a lot of quail. 60 bushel baskets full of quail. What did they do with them? They cleaned them, they spread them out in the sun to dry, and then they started to eat them. When they ate them, this clock says I've got 12 more minutes to go, but obviously this clock must have stopped when the electricity did. So anyway, to make a long story short, they ate quail, they got sick, many of them died, and the name of the place is Grave of Lust, or Grave of Longing. Indulge their lusts. We'll have to stop with that. I'm sorry. There were a couple of other interesting points there. We'll just ignore those. We'll move on next week. And I should have been looking at my watch instead of the clock in the back. We'll meet again next week.